Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we should get into our next segment on today's show, and it should be a good one, I do want to remind you guys yet again to, if you do feel so inclined, consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Also consider leaving a question, comment, or concern that I will address at the beginning of my next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into another player profile concerning a QB who I definitely feel will be getting a lot of attention either after this season or in the off-season based on how he performs, and that is Anthony Richardson. Like I said, we did not get the full Anthony Richardson experience, only a taste of it last year, as he suffered a shoulder injury in Week 4, but from the stats we have, from that small sample size, it certainly looks as if Anthony Richardson will have staying power. So let's jump right into them. In the 4 games he played last year, he accrued 72.7 fantasy points. However, in the 2 full starts that he had, where he went the distance in all of both those games, he averaged 25.7 fantasy points per game. If that is taken over a full season, that is a QB1 rating right there. So put that in perspective. I know it's a small sample size for a rookie quarterback who was seen as more of a developmental prospect in that draft class, and yet in 2 full starts he proved that he could be something in this league, and I don't necessarily know whether or not that's a fluke, but if it isn't, then we're looking at a kid who's really special here. He led all QBs in fantasy points per dropback, which is really interesting considering that a lot of people thought his best trait was his rushing ability. The fact that he kind of played a physical style through the ground game and was seen more of as like a running back quarterback hybrid. He averaged 8 yards per attempt last year, and he had 7.14% big time throw rates. He was 5th in rush yards per game. Like I said, that will always be his strong suit, his forte. And he was also 3rd in red zone carries, which could really, really launch him into the stratosphere if he gets a ton of red zone looks and touchdowns, for that matter. Next year, fantasy odds obviously don't see this kid as a fluke because they are projecting him to have a fantastic season. 3,495 yards, 19 touchdowns, 11 picks, 587 rush yards, and a whopping 7 touchdowns on the ground, for a grand total of 298.9 fantasy points. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of hope surrounding this kid. But that's the one word that a lot of people can get hung up on. Hope, because it's good to have optimism, but it's quite another to know for certain what you have in a guy. And that's the caveat with Anthony Richardson. I would love to sit here and sing his praises throughout this entire segment, but the good and the bad are quite equal here, because the good is outstanding. That small sample size, imagine that. He immediately is QB1 status right there. However, it is just 2 full games that we have for Anthony Richardson. So it's very tough to project anything. I know that a lot of people are kind of centered around blind faith when they hear about a prospect who could potentially break out. And that's what Anthony Richardson is right now. He's a heard it through the grapevine kind of player. That's one of the best ways I can think to describe him. He's someone who you're going to hear about a lot. Everyone's going to be bringing up his name, and everyone's going to be looking to see what he can be. Now, it certainly seems as if the Colts are very much in the mold of their big rivals, the Houston Texans. What I mean by that is both of these teams are young. They're both going to have second-year QBs. They both have relatively new head coaches who just came in last year in D'Amico Ryans and Shane Steichen respectively. And they both have more role player-like personnel to support their young QBs. I'm going to mention someone later in the show from the Houston Texans to show you what I mean. But overall, both of these teams don't necessarily have one true star outside of what they believe their quarterbacks are. And so it's really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see how these two quarterbacks' trajectories pan out, because they're going to be rivals in this division for quite some time. And I really think that leads to Anthony Richardson's benefit as much as it does to C.J. Stroud, because C.J. Stroud had his full season. He had his breakout rookie year. He had his moment. And so I really think that will bolster Anthony Richardson, because why can't I do what C.J. Stroud did in his season? It's kind of like, if I can make a basketball comparison a little bit, Chet Holmgren. Chet Holmgren had an injury for the entirety of his NBA rookie season, and he's becoming one of the better young big men in the league. He's rivaling Wemby. He had just as good a season as Wemby, and very well could have taken home that Rookie of the Year award in the NBA. So Anthony Richardson certainly, if recent history shows, can still be something for this Colts squad. And the stats definitely back him up. But there is another caveat here. And it has to do with weighing those skill position group options. Is the Colts position group at wide receiver and running back as good as people think it is? Michael Pittman and Josh Downs are nice names. And if you want the honest truth, they were heard of more than Nico Collins and Noah Brown and Tank Dell beforehand. So they certainly have that kind of name presence to them. But I really think that in order to know for sure what Anthony Richardson has, we're going to have to see a full season of him. And these guys looked very comfortable outside of the pressure of having a rookie quarterback last year. Obviously, Gardner Minshew took over, and they were just on the precipice of going to the postseason as the AFC South champion, but ultimately fell short to, ironically, the Houston Texans. And so, in my mind's eye, the huge question here is not only Anthony Richardson the margin that needs to be overcome in order to challenge the Texans and Jags in the division, but are the wide receivers as well, because I really love both Michael Pittman and Josh Downs, but I don't love them as guys who I can trust. Like, I would never truly draft them as, say, my wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 in my fantasy team, mainly because of the fact they haven't been go-to guys in this league. And in a division that's certainly going to become very competitive as the years go on, because every single one of those quarterbacks outside of, someone in there, whose name I'm forgetting, but outside of one of those guys, let's just say, this division has young quarterbacks who are going to scrap and claw their way for supremacy in this division for quite some time. And Anthony Richardson is immediately getting thrown into that fire. And I'm not saying he's behind schedule, because obviously, from what we've seen of him, it certainly looks like the Colts view him as someone who's ready to go in today's NFL. I certainly feel as if Anthony Richardson is going to have a chip on his shoulder this season. I think the ultimate goal for Anthony Richardson is A, to block out any noise, and B, to understand what he is expected to do in the Colts offense. And I think that also comes down to how Shane Steichen kind of helps him along, because what we saw last year was Shane Steichen dispelling any notion that Anthony Richardson was going to have any problems. Shane Steichen, for the most part, is Anthony Richardson's defender, in this league. Whatever happens with him and whatever criticisms come the Colts' way, should Anthony Richardson not pan out, Shane Steichen will have to deal with it as much as Anthony Richardson. And so that connection is very important as well, because if Shane Steichen trusts Anthony Richardson, that can go a long way to helping the Colts. But if somewhere along the line he hits a couple of speed bumps, then who knows how off the rails this Colts team can get, because I certainly don't believe the skill position players they have are as talented as others in this division or even in the AFC. I think last season definitely was a very flash in the pan, up and down roller coaster of a season for the Colts that they definitely don't want to replicate. But still, I do believe that there is some merit in the numbers Anthony Richardson was able to put up in that small sample size. We can't necessarily completely ignore them, because doing so would be foolish and not respectful of what he was able to do in those games. Because stats are stats, and at the end of the day, they're what tell the story of what a player can be and should be. So I can't ignore what I see in front of me. But on the field, certainly there can be a lot left to be desired, because we want a full season from him, because that's how exciting and anticipated this kid is, because of what we saw in those short games. Well, that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we switch teams in the division and talk about a wide receiver who I'm really thinking could be in that wide receiver 5-3 conversation this year. I'm completely serious. I really like this kid. We'll be right back to talk about him on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. You don't want to miss this next one.